Story 1. Story 1. The Fluorescent Hum. The fluorescent lights of the Level 3 archives hummed, a dull, monotonous drone that matched the rhythm of my boredom. It was 2:17 a.m., and the only other sign of life in the vast, echoing space was the intermittent tapping of Mrs. Henderson's keyboard from the security office down the hall. I sipped lukewarm coffee, the metallic tang clinging to the back of my throat, and idly flipped through a dusty volume on 18th-century shipbuilding techniques. Why the university needed a night archivist was beyond me. A soft thud echoed from the back of the archives, followed by a scraping sound. I froze, coffee sloshing over the rim of the mug. The Level 3 archives were sealed, a single access point monitored by Mrs. Henderson. There shouldn't be anything back there. Mrs. Henderson? I called, my voice shaky. The tapping ceased. No reply. Mrs. Henderson, did you hear that? Silence. Just the hum of the lights and the frantic hammering of my own heart. I grabbed the heavy mag light from under the desk, its cold metal a comfort against my clammy palm. The beam sliced through the darkness between the towering shelves, illuminating rows of bound volumes, their spines glinting like watchful eyes. Another thud. Closer this time. Followed by a low growl, guttural and wet, that sent a shiver down my spine. Hello? I called out, the word a pathetic squeak. The growl responded, deeper, more menacing. The scraping sound started again, slow and deliberate, like something dragging itself across the concrete floor. I could feel the vibrations through the soles of my shoes. I backed away, my heart pounding against my ribs. The maglite beam danced nervously, revealing nothing but shadows that seemed to writhe and shift. I had to get out. I fumbled for the door handle, my fingers slipping on the cold metal. Finally, the lock clicked open. I stumbled out into the hallway, the harsh fluorescent light a blinding relief. The security office was empty. Mrs. Henderson's chair was pushed back, her half-finished cup of tea still steaming on the desk. Her coat and bag were gone. Mrs. Henderson? I whispered, my voice cracking. The only response was the incessant hum of the lights. I ran. Down the echoing corridors, past darkened classrooms and silent labs, until I burst out into the cool night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, fumbling with the keys, my hand shaking so violently I could barely get the key in the ignition. The next day, I called the university. They told me Mrs. Henderson had called in sick. They said there had been reports of a faulty ventilation system causing strange noises in the archives. They offered me a paid leave of absence, a thinly veiled suggestion that I take some time off. I didn't go back. Weeks later, I found myself driving past the university late one night. The Level 3 archives were dark, but a single light flickered in the security office. I pulled over, my heart hammering in my chest. I could see a figure sitting at the desk, hunched over something. It looked like Mrs. Henderson. Hesitantly, I approached the building. As I got closer, I could hear a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from inside. The same tapping I'd heard that night. I pressed my face against the glass, peering into the dimly lit office. Mrs. Henderson was there, her back to me, her head bent low. She seemed to be typing. Then, slowly, deliberately, she turned. Her face was pale, her eyes vacant, black pits in a skull-like face. Her jaw hung open at an unnatural angle, revealing rows of needle-sharp teeth. A low growl rumbled from her throat, the same guttural, wet sound I'd heard in the archives. She smiled, a grotesque, inhuman grin that stretched her lips back over her teeth. And from behind her, something moved. Something large, dark, and impossibly shaped. It slithered into view, its skin glistening wetly under the flickering fluorescent light. Its multiple eyes blinked slowly, focusing on me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. I turned and ran, the image of Mrs. Henderson's face, and the thing behind her, seared into my mind. I haven't been back to the university since. I don't answer the phone when they call. I still hear the humming of the fluorescent lights in my dreams. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear the scraping sound, slow and deliberate, getting closer. I know it's coming for me. I just don't know when. Story 2. Story 2, the fluorescent hum. The clock on the wall ticked with agonizing slowness. 3:17 a.m. The fluorescent lights of the packing plant buzzed overhead, casting a sickly yellow glow over the endless rows of conveyor belts. My stomach grumbled, the cheap coffee from earlier doing little to stave off the gnawing hunger. I was alone, save for the rhythmic whirring of machinery and the distant clatter of a forklift in the loading bay. I worked the night shift, processing poultry. Not glamorous, but it paid the bills. Anything exciting happening, Martha? Carlos's voice startled me. He emerged from the shadows between two massive freezers, his face pale under the harsh lights. Just chickens, Carlos, I replied, forcing a smile. He was a nice guy, but his habit of appearing out of nowhere was unsettling. You ever get that feeling? He asked, his eyes darting around the vast, empty space. Feeling? He hesitated. Like something's watching you. Something not right. I shrugged, trying to dismiss the creeping unease his words evoked. It's just the quiet, Carlos. Plays tricks on your mind. But the quiet wasn't the problem. It was the almost quiet. A subtle, high-pitched whine had begun to permeate the air, a sound just on the edge of my hearing. I rubbed my ears, thinking it was tinnitus, but it persisted, growing slowly in intensity. Over the next few hours, the whine intensified, accompanied by a faint, rhythmic pulsing sensation in my teeth. I tried to focus on my work, mechanically grabbing and packaging chicken parts, but the unsettling sensations were distracting. Carlos seemed oblivious, chatting about his weekend plans, but his usual cheerfulness felt forced, brittle. Around 5 a.m., I noticed a change in the chickens. The skin seemed looser, almost translucent in places. The flesh beneath had taken on a strange, iridescent sheen. I chalked it up to the fluorescent lighting playing tricks on my eyes, but the feeling of unease intensified. The pulsing in my teeth grew stronger, now accompanied by a throbbing ache in my gums. I excused myself and hurried to the bathroom, desperate for a moment of quiet. I splashed cold water on my face, staring at my reflection in the grimy mirror. My eyes looked bloodshot, the pupils dilated. As I reached up to touch my face, I felt something shift beneath my skin. A wave of nausea washed over me. I stumbled back to the processing line, my heart pounding. Carlos was gone. The conveyor belt, however, was still running, piled high with chicken parts that now pulsed with the same sickening rhythm as my teeth and gums. The high-pitched whine was almost deafening now, and the throbbing pain in my mouth was excruciating. I clamped my hand over my jaw, trying to stifle a scream. Then, I saw it. At the end of the conveyor belt, amidst the mounds of glistening flesh, something was moving. It was small at first, a pulsating mass no bigger than my fist, but it was growing rapidly, expanding, unfolding. Its surface shimmered with the same unsettling iridescence as the chicken's skin, and as it grew, it began to take on a vaguely humanoid shape. I backed away slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The thing pulsed and throbbed, emitting a low, guttural growl that resonated deep within my bones. The pulsing in my own body intensified, the pain in my gums becoming unbearable. I felt a pressure building in my sinuses, a sickening sense of fullness. I reached up to touch my face again, and this time, I felt something hard and sharp pushing against the skin from within. The creature at the end of the conveyor belt continued to grow, its form becoming clearer, more grotesque. It was vaguely human-shaped, but its limbs were long and spindly, its head elongated and bulbous. Its skin was stretched taut, revealing the pulsing mass of flesh and bone beneath. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were two black, bottomless pits that seemed to suck the light from the room. The whine reached a fever pitch, and the throbbing in my mouth became an agonizing pressure. I could feel something tearing, ripping, pushing its way out from within. I tasted blood, hot and metallic. The last thing I remember is the creature lurching forward, its long, skeletal fingers reaching out towards me, its black eyes burning into my soul. And then, darkness. I woke up in the hospital, disoriented and confused. The doctors told me I'd collapsed from exhaustion and dehydration. They said I'd been hallucinating. They said there was no creature, no pulsing light, no high-pitched whine. They stitched up the lacerations inside my mouth, dismissing them as self-inflicted. But I know what I saw. I know what I felt. And the pulsing, it hasn't stopped. It's faint now, a barely perceptible thrumming beneath my skin, but it's there. A constant reminder of the horrors I witnessed in that fluorescent-lit hell. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in the dark, I hear it again. The faint, high-pitched whine. Growing louder. Closer. Story 3. Story 3, The Fluorescent Hum. The flickering fluorescent lights of the archive room buzzed, a relentless, insect-like drone that gnawed at the edges of my sanity. It was 2:17 a.m., the deadest part of the night, and I was alone, surrounded by towering shelves crammed with forgotten documents. I worked night shift at the Historical Society, a job I'd taken out of desperation. The silence, usually a comforting blanket, had begun to feel oppressive, a suffocating presence. Tonight, it was different. It felt charged. I'd been cataloguing a collection of old photographs, sepia-toned ghosts staring back at me from another time. One in particular, a portrait of a young woman with unusually large, dark eyes, had caught my attention. There was something unsettling about her gaze, a quiet intensity that made me feel observed. I shivered, pushing the feeling aside, attributing it to the chill that always seemed to permeate the archive after midnight. A soft thud echoed from the back of the room, near the locked storage area. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. I listened intently, but heard nothing more. Probably just a book falling, I muttered to myself, my voice thin and shaky. But the unease remained, a knot tightening in my stomach. The fluorescent lights flickered again, plunging the room into momentary darkness before buzzing back to life. The shadows seemed to shift and dance, playing tricks on my eyes. I rubbed my temples, trying to dispel the growing sense of unease. I wasn't imagining things. I couldn't be. Another thud. Louder this time. I stood up, my legs feeling strangely weak. I told myself it was just the old building settling, but the rational explanation felt hollow, unconvincing. The air grew thick, heavy, making it difficult to breathe. A faint, metallic scent hung in the air, like old blood. I walked towards the back of the room, my footsteps echoing unnaturally loud in the silence. The storage area door was old, reinforced steel with a heavy padlock. Nothing could have made that noise from inside. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the cold metal. A whisper. Close to my ear. So close I felt the breath on my neck. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound was guttural, inhuman. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat. Nothing. Just the endless rows of shelves, the shadows stretching and contorting in the flickering light. Panic clawed at me. I had to get out. I stumbled back towards my desk, my eyes darting around the room, searching for I didn't know what. Something, anything, to explain the growing terror that gripped me. The photograph of the woman caught my eye again. Her gaze seemed to follow me, her dark eyes burning into mine. I snatched it up, turning it over. Scrawled on the back in faded ink was a single word, listen. The whispering started again, louder this time, a chorus of voices swirling around me. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Menacing. Accusatory. The fluorescent lights buzzed frantically, the room growing darker, the shadows deeper. I dropped the photograph, backing away, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The metallic smell intensified, filling my nostrils, choking me. A low growl resonated from the storage area, a deep, guttural sound that vibrated through the floor and up into my bones. The heavy padlock rattled violently, as if something were trying to break free. Terror paralyzed me. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The lights flickered one last time, plunging the room into complete darkness. The whispering intensified, the growling grew louder, and the metallic scent became overwhelming. I felt a cold hand brush against my cheek, and a voice, raspy and close to my ear, whispered, "We've been waiting for you." Then, silence. Absolute, suffocating silence. I fumbled for my phone, the screen illuminating my trembling hands. 3:17 a.m. An hour had passed. An hour lost in the darkness, lost in the terror. The lights flickered back on, the room bathed once more in the sickly yellow glow of the fluorescence. The storage area door was still locked, the padlock undisturbed. The photograph lay on the floor, face down. I didn't dare pick it up. The silence stretched, broken only by the relentless buzzing of the lights. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what I had experienced, unsure of what was real. But one thing I knew for certain, I was no longer alone. The feeling of being watched intensified, a palpable presence in the room. I could feel the weight of unseen eyes on me, burning into my skin. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever had whispered in the darkness was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the storage area door. I reached the exit, my hand shaking as I fumbled with the lock. I burst out into the hallway, the sudden brightness blinding me. I didn't look back. I ran. I never returned to the archive. I never asked what was in the locked storage area. I don't want to know. Some things are better left undisturbed, buried in the darkness, locked away with the whispers and the growls and the metallic scent of something I can't name. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when the world is silent, I hear the buzzing. The faint, insistent buzzing of fluorescent lights. And I know, with a dread that chills me to the bone, that they are waiting. Story 4. Story 4, The Fluorescent Hum. The clock on the wall ticked with an almost malevolent slowness. 3:17 a.m. The air in the archive room was stale, thick with the scent of dust and decaying paper. My stomach grumbled, a low, lonely sound in the oppressive silence. Outside, the city slept, a vast, unknowable entity breathing just beyond the thick brick walls. I was an archivist at the city's historical society, a job I'd initially found romantic, surrounded by the ghosts of the past. Now, on my third night shift in a row, the romance had curdled into something sour, something unsettling. The silence was the worst part. A silence so profound it felt like a physical presence, pressing in on me, squeezing the air from my lungs. The rhythmic hum of the fluorescent lights overhead added another layer of discomfort, a constant, unwavering drone that seemed to burrow into my skull. Just a few more hours, I muttered to myself, the sound of my own voice startling in the quiet. I returned to sorting through a box of old photographs, sepia-toned faces staring back at me, their eyes hollow and distant. A soft thud echoed from the back of the archive room. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs. The room was vast, filled with rows upon rows of towering shelves, casting long, distorted shadows in the flickering fluorescent light. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no reply. Just the hum of the lights and the frantic thumping of my heart. I told myself it was probably just a book falling, or a rat. The building was old. These things happened. But the unease lingered, a cold knot in my stomach. I tried to focus on my work, but the silence felt different now, charged with something expectant. Another thud, this time closer. I jumped, dropping a stack of photographs. They scattered across the floor, faces staring up at me from the dusty tiles. "Okay, this isn't funny," I said, louder this time, trying to inject some false bravado into my voice. My hand fumbled for the small flashlight on my desk. Its beam, weak and pathetic, did little to dispel the shadows. I moved cautiously toward the back of the room, the flashlight beam dancing nervously across the shelves. The air grew colder, and I could have sworn I heard a faint whisper, a rustling sound like something dragging itself across the floor. The shelves seemed to loom taller, closer, as I moved deeper into the room. The silence, once oppressive, was now punctuated by a series of unsettling sounds, a faint scratching, a soft sigh, a whisper that seemed to brush against my ear. My breath caught in my throat as I saw it, a dark shape hunched between two shelves, barely visible in the flickering light. It seemed to be breathing. "Who's there?" I demanded, my voice a choked whisper. The shape didn't move. The scratching sound intensified. Slowly, cautiously, I stepped closer, my hand trembling as I held the flashlight. The beam finally landed on the shape, illuminating nothing. Just an empty space between the shelves. Relief washed over me, followed by a wave of intense confusion. I had seen something. I knew I had. I turned to leave, but then I noticed it. A single, long, black hair lay on the floor, right where the shape had been. It wasn't mine. My blood ran cold. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot. Suddenly, the lights flickered violently, plunging the archive room into near darkness. A blood-curdling scream echoed through the silence, followed by a sickening thud. My scream. I scrambled back, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly off the shelves, catching glimpses of distorted shadows that seemed to writhe and shift. I stumbled, falling onto the hard floor. The flashlight slipped from my grasp, rolling under a shelf, its weak beam illuminating a small, dust-covered box. I crawled towards it, my heart pounding in my chest. The screaming had stopped. The only sound now was the frantic rasping of my own breath. I reached under the shelf, my fingers brushing against something cold and smooth. The box. I pulled it out, my hand shaking so violently I could barely hold it. It was made of dark wood, intricately carved with strange symbols I didn't recognize. It felt wrong. Hesitantly, I opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single, human eye. It stared up at me, its pupil dilated, reflecting the faint light from under the shelf. It looked alive. And then, I heard the whispering again, closer this time, right behind me. It wasn't a human voice. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The eye in the box seemed to pulse with a faint, sickening light. I knew, with a chilling certainty, that whatever was behind me was not human. And it was watching me. The fluorescent lights flickered back on, illuminating the empty archive room. The silence returned, heavier, more oppressive than before. The box lay open in my lap, the eye still staring. I sat there, frozen, listening to the low hum of the lights, the whispering gone. Waiting. The clock on the wall ticked. 4:58 a.m. Just a few more minutes until dawn. But I knew, deep in the pit of my stomach, that the dawn wouldn't bring any solace. Something had changed. Something had shifted. And I was alone, trapped in the echoing silence of the archive room, with the single, staring eye and the growing, unshakable feeling that I was no longer alone. And that whatever was here with me, in the fluorescent hum of the pre-dawn hours, would never truly leave. Story 5. Story 5, The Fluorescent Hum. The flickering fluorescent lights of the packing plant buzzed like trapped insects. It was 3:17 a.m., the deadest part of the night shift, and the rhythmic thump of the conveyor belt was the only sound besides the low hum of the machinery and my own breathing. My stomach growled, a hollow echo in the cavernous space. I peeled a banana, the sweet scent a stark contrast to the metallic tang of the air. Slow night, who? Maria's voice startled me. She materialized beside me, her face pale under the harsh lighting, her dark eyes sunken. Yeah, I mumbled, shoving the rest of the banana in my mouth. Slower than a snail in molasses. Maria chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. Just the way I like it. Less chance of accidents. Her words hung in the air, unsettling me. Maria was new. She'd only been working here a week, and something about her unnerved me. Her movements were jerky, almost twitchy, and she never seemed to blink. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to caffeine and exhaustion. We all looked a little off after a few weeks on the night shift. An hour crept by. The conveyor belt suddenly shuddered to a halt. A collective groan rippled through the handful of us scattered across the vast factory floor. Power surge, Carlos, the foreman, yelled over the sudden silence. Probably that damn storm. Should be back up in a minute. But the light stayed off. The emergency lights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows that danced across the machinery. The silence was thick, oppressive. Then, a low, guttural growl echoed from the far end of the plant, near the loading docks. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs. Maria didn't answer. She was staring towards the loading docks, her eyes wide, unblinking. A thin smile stretched across her face, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too long. The growling came again, closer this time. It was followed by a wet, sloshing sound, like something heavy being dragged across the concrete floor. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through me. "We should go," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I tugged on Maria's sleeve, but she didn't budge. Her smile widened, and I noticed something wrong about her skin. It seemed to be shimmering, almost translucent in the dim light. "Maria," I said, louder this time, fear constricting my throat. She turned to me, and her eyes, no longer human, burned into mine. They were milky white, devoid of pupils, reflecting the faint emergency lights like polished stones. The growling sound was right behind her now, closer than I'd thought possible. I could smell something putrid, something sickeningly sweet, like rotting meat. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Maria's skin began to ripple, to undulate beneath the thin fabric of her uniform. Her fingers elongated, the nails thickening into sharp, black claws. The bones in her face shifted, her jaw extending, her mouth opening to reveal rows of needle-like teeth. The growling stopped. A wet, sucking sound replaced it, followed by a sickening crunch. I didn't want to look, but my eyes were drawn to the source of the sound. In the dim light, I saw it. A shapeless mass, pulsing and writhing, consumed by shadows. And protruding from the darkness, I saw a hand, unmistakably Maria's hand, the skin now a sickly green, the fingernails replaced by long, black claws. The hand twitched, then went still. Terror seized me, paralyzing me. I couldn't scream. I couldn't breathe. The fluorescent lights flickered back on, bathing the factory floor in their harsh, unforgiving glow. The conveyor belt started again, its rhythmic thump a deafening pulse in the sudden silence. The shapeless mass was gone. So was Maria. I stood there, frozen, the metallic tang of the air now mixed with the lingering stench of decay. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs felt like lead, my voice trapped in my throat. I looked down at my hands, flexing my fingers, trying to convince myself that I was still real, that this was just a nightmare. Then I noticed it. A small, pulsing lump beneath the skin on the back of my hand. It throbbed in time with the hum of the machinery, growing larger, warmer with each passing second. I pressed my finger against it, and a sharp, stinging pain shot through my arm. I looked around. The factory floor seemed different. The shadows seemed deeper, the machinery more menacing. The rhythmic thump of the conveyor belt now sounded like a heartbeat, a slow, steady, ominous heartbeat. The fluorescent lights flickered again, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I wasn't alone. Something was watching me. Something was waiting. And the night shift had just begun.